Hello, and welcome to this video where I'm going to try to explain to you what are cluster checks and endpoint checks and how they can be useful for you if you're using Datadog in a Kubernetes cluster. My name is Sara Pulido, that's my Twitter handler. So if you have any follow-up comments, any questions, feel free to reach out on Twitter or leaving a comment on this video. Just to let you know, this video is completely hands-on, so we are going to explain this using a real Kubernetes cluster. And the good thing is that we are trying to do these videos as easy as possible for you to replicate everything that we learn here. So we also have created a lab scenario in our learning environment, so you can give it a try yourself. So let's start quickly with this. Once you enter your in this lab environment, I will leave a link at the end and the description of the video on how you can access this. A new Datadog account, trial account, will be created for you, so you don't have to use your production environment to test these things. So it's going to be super easy to do it yourself if you wish to. So this is the environment. So it has created an account for me. I already had logged in on that Datadog account that was created for me. And yeah, this is the environment. So I can see that I already have my API key already exported there. If you do things like this. I have my nodes running. So I have a 2-node cluster running 116. So let's start by doing the first thing that we need to do is deploying the Datadog node agent. So what is the Datadog node agent? We are not going to go too much into detail here, but basically, just so you know, in order to gather information about the pods that are running in your cluster, Datadog uses a daemon set called the node agent. So it's going to be deployed on every node of your cluster. And it's going to start gathering information from the kubelet about the containers that are running on that particular node. So that's the first thing that we need to do in order to start monitoring our Kubernetes cluster using Datadog. So let's do that. We are going to be using Helm for this. Helm is already deployed on this test cluster, so you don't have to. But this is the values.yaml that we are going to use. Very simple. Let's just Helm install very quickly to get that up and running. And let's see what we get. So we actually get two different things. If we get the deployments now that we have on that system, we see that we have a new deployment called kubestate metrics. When you deploy the Datadog node agent using the Helm chart, by default, it also deploys kubestate metrics deployment. And that is an open source project, a CNCF project, part of the Kubernetes project that gathers metrics around about the Kubernetes API. So it gathers metrics about how many deployments do you have in your cluster, how many daemon sets, how many nodes, et cetera, so you can also quickly check those using Datadog. So the first thing that it has deployed, but obviously it has also deployed the Datadog daemon set. So if we clean this a little bit, and we do it again, we can see that we have a daemon set. You can check that we actually said that a cluster had 2 nodes, a master or control plane and node, and we only got 1 Datadog node agent. Shouldn't we get 2? The reason why we're not getting 2 is because in this particular cluster, the control plane node has attained. So if you wish to deploy Datadog on that, you have to create a toleration. So we are not going to do that. We are going to stick to 1 for now. And once this is up and running, so if we check the pods, we can see the Datadog pod is up and running. We can run this command, the agent status, that will give us information about what the node agent is doing, what type of checks is running, etc., etc. So if we click that to run that command, one of the good things about our lab environment is that for any command that you see there, just click and it will run for you. You can also type it. This is basically just normal Ubuntu VM running Kubernetes, so feel free to do so as well. So if we run the agent status, we can see everything that is happening and the checks that, that it's running. So it's good. That means that we have the Node agent app and running. So the next thing that we are going to do is to have something to monitor. Obviously, right now we are monitoring the Kubernetes pods themselves, but usually what we are going to do in a Kubernetes cluster is run applications on top. So if we check what we are going to deploy, we are going to create an nginx deployment. This nginx deployment is using an image that I created that is basically based on the Bitnami nginx one. So we are going to create that deployment and we're going to create a service for that deployment. And so let's do that. So we already have this file, YAML file already ready for you. So let's apply that one. Again, you can do two things. You can basically type this command or just click there and it's going to type it for you. And you can see that it has created the deployment and it has created the service. And if we click here, you can see that the nginx deployment is up and running. Well, it's still creating those, and you have the service. So if we get the pods that we have in our cluster, we can see the 3 nginx pods that are now running. So one of the things that happens is that once we start running those pods, we want Datadog to start monitoring those applications, in this case, nginx. If we click on the status and we go back and see the checks, the nginx check is not here. The reason why it's not here is because we are not using the official nginx image. If we had used nginx image from the nginx Docker Hub, that would have been picked automatically. But because I'm having one, I have to tell it somehow, Datadog, that this is actually nginx, and I want to run the nginx check and get all the metrics for nginx, all the default dashboards, etc., etc. So how do we do that? So we do that through annotations. So what we are going to do is to modify the nginx deployment and create these annotations. Basically, we are going to tell the Datadog agent that this particular pod, for every pod of this deployment, this is basically an nginx pod and the link to the status URL where it takes the metrics. So this is what we are going to do. This is an example of how we can do it as well for Redis. This is what we call Autodiscovery. So if you have any questions about Datadog Autodiscovery, just Google that. I will also leave links, but it's very powerful way to make sure that all the pods are running the checks that are necessary. So let's apply this new deployment that we have here. Let's clear this a little bit. And you can see that service wasn't changed. We haven't changed anything on the service. Deployment is now configured. Let's check the pods. It's still rolling, updating those pods. So let's check that it's all running. There are still a couple of them that are terminating, so that's good. Now they're all running. So as soon as we add those annotations, the Datadog agent, once it starts checking those pods, again, it's going to say, okay, this is an nginx pod. I need to run the nginx check. Let's run again the status command for the Datadog agent on this particular node. And you can see it's already running. So for every pod, everything, obviously we only have one worker node. So that's where all our pods are going to be running. So every nginx check is going to be run by the same Datadog pod. In this case, this one. So you can see that there are already 3 instances of this check already running. So if we go back to our Datadog account that was created for us, now we can start seeing a little bit more of what we are getting here. So Datadog is already sending, you can see our 2 nodes here with all the information of CPU that is being used, et cetera, et cetera. And if we go to the dashboards that we have now, automatically, without us having to do anything, Datadog activated on the backend as well the nginx dashboards. So without you having to do anything, you suddenly have these fantastic dashboards to start gathering metrics about your nginx deployment. Good, that's great. Let's move on to try to explain what are the cluster checks and Datadog cluster agent and why we need it. So the first thing that I'm going to explain here is that what is the Datadog cluster agent? So the Datadog cluster agent, it's a specific deployment that you can deploy as well when you're deploying Datadog in your Kubernetes cluster. It's a little bit different from the node agent. It's basically a normal deployment. It's not a daemon set. And it has many, many features. So we really recommend you to deploy that one as well. One of the main features, for example, is that it's going to act as a proxy between the node agents and the API server. So you make sure that that you don't have all those node agents poking the API server all the time. And also, the cluster agent is needed for cluster checks. So what are cluster checks? So basically, when you have this situation like the one that we have right now, you have all your nginx pods, but also you have this load balancing system in Kubernetes called a service, a Kubernetes service, that is basically going to load balance traffic between all the different pods. So when you make a request to the service, not a particular pod, and then Kubernetes is going to load balance that traffic. So we may want to know the latency of the service. We may want to know if there are any certificates that are missing on that service, rather than these specific pods. So how do we do that? We do that through cluster checks. So cluster checks basically is the same type of checks that we have for pods, but instead of having for containerized workloads, it's for non-containerized workloads. So it's for things like Kubernetes services, there are no containers, or for external services as well, if you want to check an external service, et cetera, et cetera. So the first thing that we will need to do is to deploy the cluster agent. It's needed for the cluster checks. So what we are going to do is to have the same Helm values file, but we are going to change some of the values. So we are going to change the cluster agent enable to true, cluster check enable to true as well, and we are going to give it a cluster name, in this case category, that we can call it whatever. So if we check the difference between the 2 files that the first Helm values that we use, and this one, you can see that the only changes that we made was adding that cluster name, enable cluster checks, and enable the cluster agent. So let's deploy that. Again, So you can see that we are doing, again, a Helm install after a Helm delete. You can type all of this if you want. You can click if it's easier for you. So basically what it's going to do is to create a new Helm deployment for the Datadog. And now if we get, you can see that we get a new deployment that we didn't get before, a deployment called Datadog Cluster Agent. And this is basically the deployment that it's going to deploy the cluster agent. If we get the pods, you can see that now we have the node agent as we had before, the Kubestate metrics pod as we had before, but now we have a new pod for the cluster agent. Cool. So let's wait until this is up and running. It's already running, it's ready, great. So once it's up and running, the cluster agent has the same commands as the node agent. So we can run the status command and check what it's running on that one. So you can see that the only check that is running is the one for the API server. As we said, the cluster agent, one of the missions it has, it's become this proxy between to gather information about the API server in case the node agents need that. Good. So let's create our first cluster check. So again, going back to this schema that we have here, we have an nginx pod, in this case, 3 replicas, not 5, like it's shown here, and we have an nginx service. What we are going to do is to enable another check, the HTTP check, that is going to give us the latency, the request per second, the certificate status for that particular service. So how do we do that? So in this case, by the way, we are going to use this particular HTTP check. You have here all the information if you want to know what type of metrics we are going to get out of it, the different options, etc. It's all on the official documentation. So what we need to do is to apply annotations the same way that we did for the deployment, but this the service instead. So we already have this, so we are going to keep the annotations for the pods themselves in the deployment, but we are going to add new annotations to the service. You can see that we are basically saying that for this particular service, we are going to run the HTTP check, and we are going to say, where is our nginx, basically on the same IP that the service is getting. So again, if you run the diff between those two files, you can see that the only difference is that we have added that information. Good, so let's apply that change. So you can see that in this case, it's the other way around. The deployment hasn't changed, but we've changed the service. We changed the service just by adding those annotations. We haven't done anything else because this is not a containerized workload, it's a service. We don't have to wait until pods are running. And now we can see how the cluster agent with a new command, we can see that it's already picking this up. So if we run this command against the cluster agent pod called cluster checks, agent cluster checks, you can see that it says that there is a cluster check on node 1, which is the HTTP check for that particular service. So in this case, we know that the node 1 agent is the one running this one. So basically what the cluster check does, the cluster agent does when it sees a cluster check is to make sure that only one node agent is running the check, is basically responsible of dispatching this check. So it checks, it finds that there is a new cluster check and it's going to dispatch this check to this particular node. So if we run the agent status now on the node agent, we can see that there is a new check now, the HTTP check for this particular service. Why this particular node agent is running? Because the cluster agent decided that it was the best one to run that one, so it dispatched that particular one to this one. Good. So same thing, now that we have those that check running, you can see that we already have new metrics coming in automatically in our Datadog account. Things like, for example, the HTTP response time. And those metrics are coming from the service and not the particular pods. So that way you can also have information about non-containerized workloads. Good. But what about if in our small cluster today, it's fine because we don't have that many workloads, this is an example, but what if all our node agents are already pretty busy running the pod checks that are the ones that they're supposed to be running? How we avoid adding more workload to those with the cluster checks? And the solution to that is deploying what we call at Datadog cluster check runners. The cluster check runners is exactly the same thing. It's basically a Datadog agent that is going to run checks. The only difference is that it's going to be focused on running the cluster checks only. So it's not going to run any particular other pod ones. So the way we enable that, again, using the helm chart that we are going to be using today, is by making this option, cluster checks running, enabled to true, and the number of replicas that we want. If we clear the window here and we check the difference between the home values that we were using before and this one, you can see that the only difference is that we reduce the number of replicas to 1, the default is 2, and we have enabled cluster checks. So let's do that. Let's helm delete and helm apply, helm install in this case. And now you can see if you check deployments, that now we have a new one. Now we have the Kubernetes metrics as we had before, the cluster agent as we had before, and now we have a new one with 1 replica for cluster checks. Good. So let's wait until all of that is up and running. Everything is running. So we have the node agent up and running and ready, the Kubernetes metrics ready, the cluster checks, the cluster agent. Fantastic. So let's run now the agent status for the cluster check runner pod. So we have run the status for the node agent before, and we were seeing that the HTTP check was running by the node agent. But now that we have a cluster check runner, if we do the agent status against the cluster agent pod, you can see that it's now this one who is running the HTTP check and only the HTTP check. So in this case, the cluster agent is going to realize that now there is a cluster check runner, and it's going to dispatch the cluster checks to the check runners instead of the node agents. Good. The last thing that we are going to see today is the endpoint checks. So the endpoint checks, this is a very common case where you have, in our case, to run the nginx checks, we only had to annotate the deployment because it was the only deployment that was moving to that service. What about if we have several deployments or individual pods? Those are Kubernetes service endpoints. And the Kubernetes service endpoints can be really, doesn't have to be one deployment, it can be several deployments, can be individual pods, etc. In those cases, it's a little bit more difficult to know how to annotate those pods to make sure that they're running, in this case, the nginx pod. So what we are going to do today is that endpoint checks fixes that in a way. So instead of annotating the template of the pods of our deployment, for example, we are going to annotate the service again. And we are going to see this one. In this case, what we have done is to remove the annotations from the deployment, keep the HTTP check for the service, but then use something called the endpoint checks. Basically, it's a different annotation that says, for any endpoint for this particular service, run the nginx check. So let's do that. Let's apply that new service. We can see in this case that both were changed. The deployment nginx pods changed because we removed that annotation. And now we have changed as well the service, adding those nginx annotations. So let's see that everything is up and running now. Good, everything is already running. Now you can see that if we're running the cluster checks, you can see that now we are running the nginx pod for any endpoint that we have. So basically, we have 3 different endpoints now up and running, apart from the HTTP check for the service. So that way we are able to be a lot more flexible in deciding what is part of a service. If we run the agent status for that particular, for the node agent, you can see that the nginx one is still up and running with 3 replicas here. So endpoint checks do get dispatched to the node agents as expected. So depending on where the pod is running, it's going to be run by one node agent or another one. Good. So this is all I had for today. I hope you learn and you're able to run this lab with me together. So I'm going to leave all the links that you need to test this yourself, links to documentation if you want to learn more. And please, any comments of things that you want me to cover in these videos, just leave a comment and I'm sure I'll be able to do so. Thank you very much and see you next one.